Hey YouTube, thanks for joining me on this care collab on Dendrobium Aphyllum. I'm Kim. If you're new here, let me give you a quick summary of my channel. I've been growing orchids for the past 5 or 6 years as a low commitment hobby. I get most of my orchids from a chain home improvement and garden store called Lowe's. Last year, I rescued more than 100 orchids from a longtime orchid grower named William Youngblood, who is from Beaumont, Texas. I grow almost all my orchids outdoor in Texas Gulf Coast area. Well, let's get on with the main reason for the show. I have done a video on care and culture of deciduous dendrobiums last year, and I will have a link below this video if you'd like to see it. This video will be specific to aphyllum and some updated information as I grow my knowledge and experience. I'm doing the care collab with several other channels, and I'll have a link to their channels in my description box. I hope you will visit all of these resources too, because everyone will have unique experiences to share. And the channels that are participating along with me are Fernanda Nascimento Orchids and Succulent, Eunice Orchids and ADD, Todd's Tropicals, Simply Orchids, etc., Orchids 365, Rogers Orchids, and Ninja Orchids, our very dedicated care collab coordinator. Thank you, Nina, for coordinating this care collab. Alright, here is our game plan today for our discussion of aphyllum. First, we're going to talk brief facts and native habitat of the plant. Secondly, we're going to go through the history of my aphyllum. Third, we're going to talk about care and culture in 4 different phases. Fourth, we'll talk about propagations. 5, some miscellaneous details. Alright, let's get started. Aphyllum's native habitat is generally found in Southeast Asia around the countries of Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and also found in parts of India, the Himalayas, and Nepal. The word aphyllum comes from the Greek origin of aphyllus, meaning no leaf or leafless. The common name is also considered to be called the hooded orchid for the shape of its flowers. Dendrobium aphyllum goes by many other botanical name or scientific name at one point. Back in the old days, in 1800s, when a couple of peoples were documenting the orchid, they didn't know that it was the same orchid, so they each had a different name for it. An illustrator by the name of Sir William Hooker, who documented Dendrobium, called it Pieridii. And then Robert Brown also documented it, and he called it Dendrobium cucullatum. Then in 1985, I am guessing this, that with modernization of maybe the filming and photography, a botanist by the name of Gunnar Scheitenfaden figured out that both Pieridii and cucullatum were the same orchids that most people now today call Dendrobium aphyllum. Now on to part 2. Let's talk about the history of my aphyllum. I got this dendrobium from another orchid hobbyist who is a longtime collector and had a lot of aphyllum keikis one year, and I think he just gave it too much water one winter. At this time, I just got started again in getting interested in orchid. I didn't know anything about this orchid, and when you're starting to collect, you'll take anything free. I didn't even Google it when I got it. I just said, "Oh, thank you so much." As I learned more about the orchid, I realized I was really intrigued with this orchid. I think it's the novelty of these fragile blooms on a bare cane. It's so contradictory that you have something that looks lifeless, which are the bare canes, and yet so many beautiful fresh blooms on the cane and a sign of life. I don't have a picture of the orchid when I originally got it in 2019, and it was April, so that would be the beginning of a new growing season. So I'm assuming that the keikis are already a year old, so we'll call that year 1. And this coming year that I just received the keiki, I'll call it year 2. The keikis were about 1 to 2 inches long, and they were super skinny with barely any roots. And the new growth that comes from these keikis will be the start of the year 2 growth. I mounted it to a cedar board that has a netty pocket, and this was made by William Youngblood. This is not the original plant, of course. I don't have a picture of the tiny keikis on the mount when I first mounted it. This is simply to show the cedar board and the netting. Here is a picture of the orchid at the end of its 3rd year. because I wasn't sure how long to keep the orchid in a dry winter rest. But I did get one bloom and lots of buds that never matured. This was a good groundbreaking year as I saw that I was on the right path with the winter rest. And here is the picture of that single bloom that I got in the end of the year 3 of the orchid, and it's in April 2021, and that's a continuation of year 3 for me. So we're counting April 2020 to April 2021 as 1 year for this orchid. In year 3, a few of the kings gave me 2 new growth, but in year 4, almost all of the kings gave me at least 2 new growth, sometimes 3. And the size of the king and the volumes of the kings really started kicking in. I was also getting a bundle of blooms this year. This is my most rewarding year. And now we're at the end of year 5, March 2023. If you see any tiny buds turning brown, I think it's from leaving the orchid out in the cold one day in March, and the youngest buds didn't make it, but the larger ones did survive. And I was out in the morning checking on the orchid and noticed that there was always a gecko on this orchid and less buds every morning after 3 days. I looked at the floor and no drops of buds. I think the buds went into somebody's tummy. I decided to bring the orchid indoors. I didn't want to bring the orchid indoors too soon before the buds fully open because I was afraid that it would bud blast from the temperature difference between indoor and outdoors. I don't think I have a choice now. I need to go ahead and bring the orchid in before the geckos eat all the buds. In the end, I only have 3 blooms. I am so mad at those geckos. This year, I'm going to separate some of the plants to give them more space to grow. On Google Images for a phylum, I see some very large kings, like 4 to 5 feet long, and I wonder how old they must be to get that big. Then I realize I need to give mine more room to grow. They are all crammed up in this mount. I also need to replace the moss this year. Part 3. I am breaking up this part of the discussion into 4 phases, and the phases are not official. It is just my way of categorizing the different care stages based on what the orchid is doing. The 4 phases that I'm going to use in discussing care and culture are growth phase, resting or dormancy phase, coming out of dormancy, and then bloom phase. Remember that I'm in the deep south in the Gulf Coast area, Zone 9, so some adjustment should be considered for the different growing areas. The growth phase starts whenever there is a new growth on the king, and it overlaps the bloom phase. I usually see the new growth start out a few weeks after I see the buds form. With the phylum, usually I get 1 new growth at the base near previous year's king for the first 2 years of the plant. These are fast-growing orchids, so much that I can see changes every day during the growing periods. I fertilize frequently during growth season, but I stop when the leaves are turning yellow. A lot of leaves to grow out, so feeding is critical. Their roots are fine and sensitive to fertilizer burn, so strong fertilizer is not a good idea. I water very often and I try not to let the media dry out for too long. When the leaves begin to wilt, that means the plant is drying out too long. It seems that a phylum will grow multiple new growths after 3rd year, and by 4th year, for sure, every king seems to have at least 2 new growths. On the topic of lighting, I don't think that a phylum needs very high intense light during the growth season. I think the same amount of light intensity for Brassivola would work for a phylum. I grow my aphyllum in the outdoor shower, and it sits facing east. And it gets a lot of light from above because there is no roof and it has a 50% shade cloth above. This is probably more light than it needs, but I like it hanging in the shower, and plus I'll definitely won't forget to water it. I water it sometimes at night, and luckily the growing tip is hanging downward or upside down, so the water drips out of the crown. Here is what my aphyllum looks like on November 2021. And this is going into the resting period. A few of the lower leaves are turning yellow. This is a good point to talk about resting phase. When the temperature starts to drastically drop and the number of light hours decreases, that triggers the rest period. I lightly water when the media is dry, and eventually, when the temperature drops even more, I lightly mist if the temperature hasn't gotten below 55. By this time, there are probably no more leaves on the cane. Also remember that there is a risk of rot if we water below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Here is where I hang the orchids when it's about to rain and the orchids need to stay out because it's colder out. I put it underneath an overhang next to the outdoor shower, and when it's not raining, I'll put them all back in the outdoor shower for the bright light. Some days I will also bring them all out to full sun, but I think this might be a bit harsh. I will try a new approach this year and leave them in the shower under the 50% shade cloth. It's very bright there already. The trip to Vietnam was an eye-opening experience for me as I watched the locals grow it in central and northern part of Vietnam, where the orchid is native here. They had misting and sometimes rain during the winter. Then I realized I am too harsh on my winter resting dendrobiums. Before my trip to Vietnam, I had already had my Dendrobium Aphyllum in winter rest stages. I only mist sparingly. When I got back in mid-January, I started misting the orchid more frequently, realizing that it was okay to do so and not risk getting the keikis instead of blooms. I lightly spray 2 to 3 days or every other day. One thing I learned also this year is don't give the orchid a rest too soon. Wait for the leaves to turn yellow first. Resting cycle seems to be a bit later than the nobile types of dendrobium, and the duration is a bit longer than the nobile types, it seems. Another common mistake I made was starving it too soon. I should have fed the orchid up till the time that the leaves stopped growing. The third phase is what I call coming out of dormancy. Signs of new growth and signs of growth on the canes, keikis, or bloom buds will initiate this next phase. The buds will start forming along the canes, and soon after, the new growth will start developing too, and the buds will be almost fully developed. I started watering lightly immediately when I saw the bumps along the cane, and I increased watering and started fertilizing when I saw the new growth. And if you're curious to see how long it takes the buds to develop, these are the buds that I discovered on February 23rd of 2023. And the buds will only develop on this year's growth. And here's the progression on March 20. I was so excited to see so many new buds this year. However, I'm very disappointed that I left it out in the cold one night and few of the smaller buds are starting to brown. The buds tend to develop just in the middle of the cane for a relatively young plant. Even for adult aphyllums, I rarely see flowers at the tip of the cane. And the buds are officially opened on April 9th. And this takes us to our fourth and final phase, the bloom phase. And of course, not every growth cycle will have a bloom phase. If we water too much during the winter, we end up with keikis. We'll skip the bloom phase. And the blooms will last usually about 2 weeks. The flowers are really, really thin and they're somewhat translucent, but they are very, very fragrant. See how the shape of the flower looks like a hood or a bonnet? I'm going to keep it in the kitchen for as long as I can to prolong the bloom and avoid the wind and rain from the outdoors. Let me give you an idea what the colors of the flowers look like with natural lighting from the outdoors. Number 4, propagation. Dendrobium Aphyllum multiplies very quickly, especially if you started out with several keikis already. The best time to separate the keikis is at the end of the growth season so that you can differentiate the care for the continuous growth of the keikis versus a dry rest for the full-grown kings to induce bloom. This benefits the mother king, which has an open bloom from the removal as the womb dries up during the dry rest. And the keikis benefit from the mother king's nutrition as long as possible. If we leave the keiki on the mother king during the dry rest period, it will likely die with exposed roots and very little watering, as mine did because I did not need the keikis, so I left them on the kings. Use the large bare king that are rootless. We can lay the king down on moss and keep it watered all winter, and hopefully we will get keikis along the king. And of course, divisions of full-size pieces of the plant with roots would be the best and fastest way to duplicate a large and reblooming plant. And here's a bit of more information that are just miscellaneous. Each year, the new kings get bigger than the previous year. The king seems to only last about 2 years, and then they dry up. Maybe, I wondered however, if they are larger each year, will they last longer than the previous years? Well, thank you for joining me on this care collab. Please hit the like button if you like this video, and please subscribe if you'd like to see more of this type of videos. See you all in the next video. Bye-bye.